Good morning. Thanks so much for being up bright and early. I know we kept you up late with conversations about Egypt last night, so I invite you to take your seats. Good morning. So we've spent the last 2 days talking about the social contract, the ways in which it's been frayed, the ways in which it's been undermined, and the ways in which we can craft a very new social contract. We began with a conversation about the roles for governments, for national governments. We moved on to a conversation on the roles for the private sector and private sector mechanisms. We talked about the social and philanthropic sector, and of course last night talked about the citizen sector and its importance. Today we're joined this morning by Anthony Lake of UNICEF, Executive Director of UNICEF, and here the conversation will be about the importance of knowledge, the importance of learning, in fact the importance of each sector, each party to the social contract being engaged in continuous learning. Tony Lake has been in public service for 45 years. I was lucky enough to work with him twice, both in the State Department and the National Security Council staff. He was National Security Advisor. He was head of policy plans at State years ago. He was the president's special envoy in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Haiti. And he was, starting in the 1970s, was director of the International Voluntary Services. I hope you'll join me in welcoming Anthony Lake.
Oh, that's right. I'm about to show that I'm going to be talking a little bit about technology, and already you're sensing just how good I am at it. Let me put this here. So thank you, Jane, very much for inviting me to be here. I had already heard from my wife, who was here yesterday, at how much energy there is in the room, and she was very excited to have taken part, and I am too. And as I look around, in fact, I can already see one change in the face of philanthropy. And in fact, I can see the change in your faces since I took part in 2004, I think, because once philanthropy was the domain primarily of older people, those who'd done well in their careers and had built foundations and bequeathed their legacies. And now they've been joined by a much younger demographic, people. Well, you see, I don't applaud that myself. If you look at my, anyway. But it's true, and it's great. People in mid-career with as much creativity as they have capital, people with innovative solutions to serious global challenges, entrepreneurs who want to invest in social issues and achieve results, which is all that matters, team players who recognize that success can often come from very unlikely partnerships, people like so many of you. There's never been a better time or a greater need for the ideas and the energy of philanthropists. Contemporary snapshots of the world, I'm not telling you anything new, show troubled economies, decreasing aid budgets, for the most part, natural disasters, man-made conflicts. I've just been in the Sahel, water shortages, rising food prices. The pace of progress towards the Millennium Development Goals, which, as you recall, were our 8 promises to children for a better life, is far too slow for far too many children. For example, 180 million children under the age of 5 throughout the developing world are stunted. Over 3,000 children under 5 die every day as a result of diarrhea. That's over 1 million children every year. I saw last week how children are already dying from severe acute malnutrition in Western Chad, and up to 1.5 million children across the Sahel are now facing, over the coming lean season, the probability of severe acute malnutrition, which means that they will be in imminent death, danger of dying. That crisis, by the way, is not appearing in our headlines, is barely being covered at all. is going to be probably affecting 3 times as many children as we saw in Somalia last year. And I think all of us have to do everything we can to end the global indifference to this crisis that will be upon us over the coming months. The scale of all of these development issues is daunting, and the current economic landscape makes them all the more challenging as governments in the North cut aid, as governments in the South also are facing budget crises, and as the old distinctions between donors on the one hand and recipients on the other is eroding as middle-income countries become, in effect, both. As I thought about today's meeting, I wondered to what extent current events had affected philanthropy worldwide. It wouldn't be unreasonable, I thought, if philanthropists were following the lead of governments in scaling back resources for development and for humanitarian efforts. And then I read Jane's interview in last month's Forbes magazine. I read it for its style as well as its substance. It was excellent. Whether the market is up, down, or flat, she said, the commitment to making a positive difference does not seem to flag. If anything, donors' desire for efficacy and willingness to learn from and leverage others grows when portfolios shrink. Firstly, that's a wonderful statement about common humanity. And secondly, how reassuring it must be for those in need that despite economic downturns, philanthropists continue to extend a lifeline. I was also struck in her interview by our shared sense of purpose, because much of what concerns philanthropists like you concerns agencies like UNICEF. Namely, as the continuing fiscal crisis forces all of us to tighten our belts and reduce our budgets, how can we be ever more efficient and innovative with those precious resources that we have? There are many ways to do this. One, and I think this will surprise you, is through an equity approach, focusing on reaching the most disadvantaged children. You might think that I'm simply making a moral argument, and it is a moral argument. But it is also a compelling argument, we believe, for greater cost effectiveness, which is why UNICEF has been, over the last 2 years, refocusing the work of all of our 151 country offices around the world on equity. And secondly, we can do this through innovations, which are enabling our equity focus by cutting the costs of getting the service to those who are the most in need in the hardest to reach areas. So let me take a few moments to tell you what prompted our focus on equity. 2 years ago, as the global community celebrated declining poverty rates as measured through national averages, we also saw that growing disparities within many countries meant that millions of children were being left behind. Children in neglected urban as well as rural communities, children living with disabilities, children from ethnic minorities, girls, the most impoverished, the hardest to reach, the forgotten children. We analyzed 26 countries where the national under 5 mortality rate had declined by 10% or more since 1990. In 18 of those 26, the gap between child mortality rates in the richest quintile and the poorest quintiles had either grown or remained unchanged. And in 10 of those 18 countries, this disparity between the rich and the poor, in literally an issue of life and death, had grown by 10%. That is simply wrong. It made me mad when I read it. On this most fundamental issue, the gap between the richest and the poorest children was growing. Average statistical successes were disguising moral failures. Our studies show that, compared to the children in the richest quintile, the poorest children are twice as likely to die before their 5th birthday, nearly 3 times as likely to be underweight, twice as likely to be stunted, and less likely to attend primary school or benefit from malaria interventions. It's difficult to think of a greater injustice. This morality gap was partly the result of longstanding development philosophy, to be blunt. a school of thought that said it would be nice to focus on those most in need. You can almost hear John Lennon singing, "Imagine if we would only do that." But it was just not cost effective. It would be too expensive and too difficult to reach into these hardest to reach communities, so let's pick the lowest hanging fruit. And if we do that and concentrate where we can get at the least expense, then we'll speed up progress towards the Millennium Development Goals. Well, that was then. Now, innovations and new technologies mean that services can be extended to the poor more effectively and inexpensively than ever before. And where also the needs are greatest, by definition, the results are greatest. The same vaccine program in an area of a lot of disease is going to save more lives than one in less disease. So we decided to rigorously test the conventional wisdom. We undertook an extensive modeling exercise to determine the cost effectiveness of an equity-focused strategy to reduce under 5 mortality. The results were so stunning to me. This was after I'd asked for the study, and I'd only been at UNICEF for a month or two, that I asked for the exercise to be rerun. I thought maybe they were just trying to please a new boss. And then when they came back with more or less the same results, slightly more sophisticated form, I brought in a team B of outside experts to try to tear it apart. And to my great relief, after a day of trying to do so, they applauded. Far from costing more, we learned that an equity-focused approach is actually more cost-effective than our current approach. In fact, in those countries with the highest burden of under 5 mortality and the worst poverty, for every $1 million or euros or whatever invested in the equity strategy, you save up to 60%, 60% more children's lives per dollar. Stunning. The conclusion, that a pro-equity strategy is not only right in principle, it's right in practice. And I might add that The Lancet, the New York Times, others wrote approving editorials about it. This is great news for our approach, and best of all, of course, it's great news for children. I'm pleased to tell you that in the wider UN family, many other agencies are emphasizing an equity approach as well. One of the most persuasive examples of value for money I can give you is stunting. Stunting. It's the 3rd time I mentioned it now in these remarks, but I wonder how many of you actually know what it is. I won't ask, but when I mentioned it at a meeting of hundreds of medical experts last year here in Washington, I saw large numbers of puzzled faces, so I asked for a show of hands, and about half of the audience of these experts raised their hands, and I suspect some of them were lying. In fact, I think it's the most underappreciated development issue that we face. Stunting is the outcome of chronic deficiency in nutrition during the first 1,000 days of a child's life, including pregnancy and up to the age of 2. The damage it causes to a child's development is irreversible. Irreversible. Cannot be fixed. A stunted child is inches shorter than he or she could have been. But this is not simply an issue of height. Chronic malnutrition makes that child more vulnerable to disease. A stunted child is 5 times more likely to die from diarrhea than a non-stunted child. And most important, a stunted child will never reach his or her full cognitive capacity, never be able to learn as much or to earn as much. When stunted child enter the workforce as an adult, their diminished physical and cognitive development can reduce their earning capacity by as much as 22%. What a tragedy. What a dreadful affliction for any child. And I don't know of a greater inequity than robbing a child, even in the womb, of his or her potential to lead a full life. 180 million children under the age of 5 are stunted around the developing world today. 180 million. That's about the same as the combined populations of Italy and France and the United Kingdom. Preventing stunting is, well, it's too late now for those 180 million children, but not too late for millions and millions of others, and it can be prevented simply and at very little expense through micronutrients such as vitamin A, zinc, iron supplements, iodized salt, as well as community nutrition programs emphasizing breastfeeding and good child feeding practices. And the price of preventing stunting in the first 1,000 days of a child's life, about $15 or $20 per child. $15 or $20 to enable the full development of a child's brain, to help a little boy or a little girl make the most of opportunities throughout life. That is a price tag we can and we must afford. In 2008, 8 of the world's leading economists in the so-called Copenhagen Consensus recommended priorities for confronting the top 10 global challenges. They ranked providing young children with micronutrients the #1 most cost-effective way to advance global welfare. That's why UNICEF is working with our partners in government and other UN agencies, as well as throughout civil society, academia, and the private sector, to help focus greater attention on undernutrition and addressing stunting urgently. In doing so, we're using a number of approaches, from the most basic, like gathering villagers together, drawing diagrams in the sand, talking about the link between poor sanitation and stunting, and to the most innovative, exploring with the private sector how new micronutrient or vitamin powders or spreads might complement foods for infants to accelerate their growth during that first 1,000 days, or using rapid SMS texting, as we're doing in many different areas, excuse me, to help community health workers report on the nutrition situation in far-flung communities. Innovations like these are at the heart of our equity strategy. They enable us to reach more effectively the hardest to reach children most cost-effectively. I'm pleased to tell you that some of our innovative work has been recognized internationally. Last year, UNICEF was selected as a DevEx Top Development Innovator based on polls of thousands of global development professionals. And Time Magazine just named our digital drum, which is a rugged solar-powered computer kiosk, which I just saw in a slum of Uganda, for use by rural children and urban communities there. They labeled it one of the best inventions of 2011. Innovative. That's something that UN agencies are not often accused of. And in truth, while I was pleased by these honors, I'm not sure that we have yet earned them, but we're working to. Most of our innovation is not based on invention, but on repurposing existing technology, largely, of course, from the private sector. Take mobile phones, for example. Our kids, and we use them to talk, to text, to play Angry Birds. I hope not right now. And UNICEF is using them also to eliminate mother-to-child transmission of HIV. Early administration of antiretroviral drugs to HIV-infected pregnant mothers and their infants can virtually eliminate mother-to-child transmission of HIV. The challenge at the heart of it is how to identify, test, and provide medicines to pregnant women and babies in a timely and effective manner. For young children who are infected with HIV, it's critical that they be diagnosed and treated immediately. This is a race against time. Without treatment, an estimated 30% of HIV-infected infants will die within 1 year of age, and 50% will die within 2 years. But diagnosis is still a lengthy and painstaking process. In one community in Zambia, it took 66 days for an infant's blood sample to travel to the lab for testing and for the results to be returned to the health worker. 66 days when every day counts. Project Moana, a pilot project supported by UNICEF with our local partners in Zambia and a similar project in Malawi, used rapid SMS to speed up the process of infant diagnosis. By sending test results directly to health workers and community clinics on their mobile phones, precious time can be saved and precious lives. And the same technology can be used to remind women in remote locations to come in for their life-saving appointments with clinics that may be a few miles or kilometers away. Since we piloted the program, it is delivering 30% more results with a 50% decrease in turnaround time. With our governments, we hope to take Project Moana to scale in both countries very soon through our network of local partners. Innovation is not only about repurposing innovative products, it's about developing innovative partnerships. One of the most important things that we can do is collaborate with private companies as they develop new products, and they keep us in mind. And in the case of a product like a vaccine, we work with partners such as the Gates Foundation, the Gavi Alliance, and the World Health Organization to identify need and lower prices. These partnerships drive a more competitive market, which helps more countries afford vital health supplies and strengthen the supply chain to meet greater demand. The lessons we've learned from this work are the impetus for the Secretary General's new Commission on Life-Saving Commodities for Women and Children, on which we serve as a vice chair. It's going to examine both the crucial barriers and problems like pricing, which limit access to affordable and effective health supplies, very simple ones, such as oral rehydration salts, and zinc to treat diarrhea, and antibiotics to treat pneumonia, the two biggest killers of children. There's nothing new about these commodities. They're cheap, they're simple products. We know that they save lives. There is no reason why everyone shouldn't have access to them. The job of the commissioners will be to determine why they are not reaching everyone and advocate for solutions to extend their reach. The recommendations will inform the discussion at the Child Survival Call to Action in Washington in June and the Family Planning Summit in London in July. UNICEF's long-standing relationships with governments and local partners, as well as our years of experience in the field, will help turn these recommendations, we believe, into results, because results are all that matter, period. Everything we do at UNICEF is aimed at exactly that, achieving results in children's lives. So we must always, every day, work at being more efficient, out of respect for our partner governments, for our donors, for the public whose taxes and contributions support us, but most of all, for the children, because every dollar or euro wasted could have been a vaccine to save a child or a school book to open a world of knowledge. I know my time is nearly up, so I'll sum up in 4 words almost. Equity, innovations, partnerships, and results. All for the children who need us most, those who inspire us evermore to be as creative and as efficient and as cost-effective as possible. That is our promise to them, and that is a promise we try to keep. Yeah.
Tony, thank you so much. I mean, you couldn't have said more clearly that learning saves lives, and saves lives particularly if institutions adapt. And the rest of the morning we'll be focusing on that kind of adaptation. But tell me how you gain beneficiary feedback. How do the crowds tell you what works, what services are delivered, and whether they work? By national governments or by UNICEF?
This is a tremendously important issue, and one that I think all of us find very frustrating. Because if you are going to manage for results, you have to be able to know what those results are in something much closer to real time than we do now. I was struck at the General Assembly Summit on the MDGs my first September in office, when, as I listened to all the speeches and even had my own, they were all based on data that was 2 years old, because it takes at least 2 years to track the results in terms of infant mortality or girls' education or whatever. So, I'm not supposed to use military allusions anymore, but if we were fighting a battle and we were deciding which hill to attack, and we were doing it based on 2-year-old intelligence, we'd attack the wrong hill. So we set out to invent a new way to try to analyze the results we were getting, especially in our innovative programs, so that we could manage more effectively. It's always going to take 2 years to look at the final results, but we've invented a system that we're now putting into place in which we measure the progress on bottlenecks. So that, for example, even if we can't measure infant mortality trends in less than 2 years, we can measure much more quickly than we do how many vaccines are getting out and what coverage there is. So all of our offices around the world now are every 6 months in chosen districts that are indicative of the situation in other parts of the country, measuring how we're doing on the bottlenecks. And what's fascinating to me is that the study that showed that it is cost effective to concentrate on the hardest to reach communities where the needs are greatest also showed that the biggest barriers to progress are not, as I had always thought, and I'll bet almost everybody in this room had usually thought, of how do we get more supplies out, more bed nets, more vaccines, et cetera. It turns out that the biggest bottlenecks are on the demand side. The capacity of poor people in these communities to take advantage of the supplies, whether it's because they face the barriers of school fees or because pregnant women can't make it the 10 kilometers to a clinic. So one of our main emphases now is to do things or to support things that we didn't invent, but are using, such as cash transfer programs, adapting them to Africa from Mexico, or campaigning for an end to school user fees, et cetera. And now what we're looking at is, rather than as a static analysis of every 6 months with a feedback loop, and we'll have dashboards to see how we're doing on all the bottlenecks, to look at the dynamics between the supply side bottlenecks and the demand side, because as you increase demand, if you get rid of health care fees, then you're greatly increasing the pressure on the supply side, and you have to anticipate that so that you don't have stockouts. So this is all fascinating. I'm a little dismayed, though, because I was just in Uganda, as I was mentioning just before we came in here. And we've been, over the last year, putting in place this system of monitoring every 6 months, which was kind of a breakthrough. But in Uganda, over recent months now, our office there has invented something called U-Report, or U-Reporters. And what they've done is, working through the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts, which are a very large organization in Uganda, and I met with their leaders a week ago, they are signing up people through cell phones to become U-Reporters, young people. It started just months ago. It's growing so fast that they had to keep changing my briefing notes before I got there. It was 70,000 3 weeks before I went. It's now 107,000 when I left, of young people around Uganda reporting probably twice a week on questions that we put to them, including in the farthest flung communities. And then we collate the results and provide them to the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education, whatever. As I was leaving, they did a question on breastfeeding. They had, within a day, 70,000 reports from all around the country showing that there was a lag in breastfeeding practices in some of the better off provinces, to our surprise, rather than some of the poorest, which is of great interest, of course, to the health ministry, to us and others. So that maybe we're going to be doing things faster than every 6 months now, if we can get the wrinkles out, make sure it doesn't become political, because we could ask questions that would get us literally thrown out of a country. But use this then to greatly speed up our ability to analyze how we're doing on bottlenecks.
You report, in one way, assesses their performance, assesses
Right.
the performance of national governments,
Well, of course,
as to whether or not they provided the services needed in an effective way. Do the governments welcome you report?
This was my biggest concern about our effort on monitoring on bottlenecks, because, and this is a key point, I think, I've become increasingly offended by the way that everybody in the business claims all the results for their own institution. Whether it's, we're working on this at UNICEF, but whether it's whether it's NGOs or other UN agencies or whatever, what are your results? Well, we've cut under 5 mortality by 2/3 since 1990, as if we had done that. And of course, we were a part of that, but we didn't do it, and there is no regression analysis good enough to exactly figure out who did how much on these results. But there is no question that the most important partners in all of this are the governments, either in a positive sense or in a negative sense. So I was very concerned that if governments knew that we were doing this new thing and out there monitoring for results much more quickly, they would think that we're going to be embarrassing them. But I have found in conversations with government leaders as I travel that if I emphasize that these are communal results that we're measuring, you can't tell who is to blame for how much, that we need to know this for the effectiveness of their programs, even more importantly than ours, and we want to monitor with them. So far, I've had probably 30 conversations with different governments, and every one of them has said, count us in, we want to do it with you.
Excellent. Unfortunately, I'm sorry to say, we are almost out of time, so we just have time to take one question. So if we put up the lights for a second and see if we can take, Tony Lake wanted to be open to all of you, but he can't see any of you. Okay, now we've got the lights. Do we have...
You're still just as young, most of you.
Do we have one question from the audience? Yes. A microphone's coming to you.
Thank you. I'm wondering, for these U reporters, are you providing cell phones or any kind of a stipend?
Nope, it's purely voluntary, but we are working with the companies that provide cell phones to work with them on how to stimulate this. I'm not sure exactly of how, I should have asked, it's being financed. But this is mostly through overwhelmingly through their own cell phones. The developing world now has far more cell phones than the industrial world does, and it's growing exponentially because it saves the problem of laying landlines. So that's not really a major inhibition. One interesting facet of it is then that it's quite transparent, because when the questions are coming out and the answers are coming in, then people are talking to reporters, and we're starting to see that some of the results are getting in the newspapers, which simply, I think, reinforces then the pressure to do a better job for all of us. As I mentioned here, one of the main things that we are working on, and I think that this is one of the great disconnects still, is working with the private sector in all of this, so that in advance, if a major cell phone provider knows that we have some apps that we want to put into it, which will increase demand for that cell phone, then they're going to make that cell phone more friendly to those apps. God, I love the way I can talk about apps as if I knew how to.
Thank you.
It's really impressive.
One fascinating app that I saw in Uganda is that Uganda has phone booths all over the country for people who can't afford cell phones. And so we have a program in which we're putting, and I'm glad this is the last question so nobody can ask me exactly how this works, but they're putting cell phone apps into the phone booths so that people, when they go to the phone booth, can actually sign up into the internet as well, which will also be, I think, transformative. When I get back to New York in a week, one of the first things I'm going to be doing is working on strengthening our innovation unit, because we need to take these things to scale. But as a management issue, as I'm sure many of you know, one of the things that I worry about most are, just as U-Report needs to be fed into the innovation of last year on the reporting on bottlenecks, so we need to be thinking about what comes after U-Report so that we don't double down on what is looks like the next wave, but is actually a small ripple before the next big wave comes. But that's fun. And we need more young people to help me figure this out.
I can't help but looking at you, hearing you talk, that this is a job and this is a role you find really joyful.
Are there any of my former colleagues besides you in the room? No. This is absolutely the best job I ever had. And you may note that when I used to talk about Bosnia, it was not with the same sense of excitement in my voice.
Please join me in thanking Anthony Lake. Thanks so much. Thank you, Tony. We are going to stay with these themes of how you can have a learning institution that increases its impact. And so I'm going to invite to the stage Caroline Anstey and Luis Ubiñas. Caroline is managing director of the World Bank. She's held many positions within the World Bank. She was chief of staff She was director for the Caribbean. She did media relations, and she was originally brought in, I think, by Jim Wolfenson, the former president of the World Bank. And we'll maybe get a chance to talk about the future president, Dr. Kim. Luis Ubiñas is president of the Ford Foundation, as you know. He comes to the philanthropic sector from McKinsey in San Francisco, and he's taking some of the disciplines that are part of private sector activity, applying them to the Ford Foundation to achieve maximum results. But we'll just start with Caroline. Welcome.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Jane, and it's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and a great pleasure to share a panel with Luis. I wanted to start by perhaps setting the context and talking a little bit about the changing world that we find ourselves in, and what that means for an institution like the bank, and for all of us in this room. I think if we cast our minds back, some of us are more able to do that than others, because I think it's quite a young audience. But to 1944, when the institution of the World Bank and the IMF were founded, really, apart from some of you here who have a long and distinguished history that predates that, the World Bank was the only development bank, reconstruction bank at that time, in town. There were no vertical funds. There were no multilateral development banks. There were some foundations, and very distinguished ones, but private capital flows were also small. 1950s, the World Bank set up its private sector arm, the International Finance Corporation. Still, no vertical funds, no NDBs, and private capital flows small. In the 1960s, we set up our International Development Association, the fund for the 79 poorest countries. Still, by and large, the bank was the only international multilateral development body in town. But when we look at today, we see a very different world. Very large-scale private flows, still flowing, with some ups and downs, some volatility from the crisis. Very large NGO, not-for-profit foundation flows. A whole series of vertical funds, the Gates Foundation, the Global Fund, and the multilateral development banks and others, regional development banks covering every region in the world. So it's a very different, much more competitive world where cooperation remains a challenge, I think, for all of us. But the world has changed in other very fundamental ways as well. In 1944, back when we were created, developed countries, rich countries, industrial countries, however you want to call them, contributed 80% of global growth. Today, it's developing countries that are the engines of the global economy, providing for 2/3 of global growth. And today, in the wake of the financial crisis, first in the US and now in Europe, it's not Europe and the US that is often being looked to as development models. It's Indian railways in Africa. It's conditional cash transfer programs based on the experience of Brazil or Mexico, now being replicated in 33 countries across the world, and even at one time being replicated in New York. Is Tunisia looking not to Western Europe or the US for its model, but looking to see how Indonesia made the transition from dictatorship to democracy, or looking to Poland to see how they made that transition. So what does this changing world mean for development? Many more actors, different models, much more South-South interaction. I think first it means we need to recognize that development is no longer north to south, west to east, top to bottom. It's a much flatter world where people will take their examples from where they see them, not from power relationships or old power hierarchies from the past. Secondly, it's a world where there is no one-size-fits-all. We know that. We're beyond blueprints or consensus from whatever part of the world they came from. It's what works on the ground. and what can be designed to fit the local political economy. And third, it means that the World Bank is no longer a monopoly. The World Bank no longer has the answers, if it ever did, but now it has to work and it has to partner and it has to see itself in a very different way. At the same time, our experience of what actually matters to development has also changed. The bank is a non-political organization. It's written in our Articles of Agreement. But much depends on how you define politics and how you define economics and how you define development. I remember, and I see Jan in the room here, some years ago when we were told corruption was a political issue, we couldn't get involved in corruption. We now know, and we've known for some years, corruption is a development issue. It's central to our remit, and so we focus on corruption. We were told that gender was a political issue, and so we couldn't be involved in gender. We now know gender is a deeply economic and development issue. Gender equality is smart economics, so it's central to our remit. We were told transparency was a political issue, and so not legitimate for the World Bank. We know that transparency is central to good development outcomes, and now we will not lend any budget support to any country that doesn't have a transparent budget. And more recently, social accountability. Some see it as political. Some see giving citizen voice as political. Some see in the wake of the Arab Spring that the kind of citizen participation in development is political and threatening. We believe it's central to development outcomes. So how have we changed to accommodate this new world? I think openness is absolutely critical. If you're part of a global network of development knowledge, if you're a player with others, you have to share your findings and you have to look to others to also come up with development solutions. So we've opened all our data, as you probably know. We used to have it pretty much closed. We used to charge for it. It's now open, and I see today in Time magazine, Hans Rosling has been heralded as one of the stars of 2012, and I think we all owe him a great debt for his work on the power of openness. We have an open data initiative. We've just adopted an open access policy for all our knowledge under a Creative Commons. I think we're the first international institution to do that. It means all our work can be taken, reused, mashed, and even reused commercially by anyone else, as long as they give an initial citation to the bank. It means we have to be much more open to development solutions. And Tony was talking about some of the innovation. I think what we're trying to do is not just release the data, but design the apps that go with the data. So we did a lot of work on poverty, on the global poverty indicator of $1 a day, recently changed to $1.25 a day as the poverty line, based on household surveys. We're now releasing the app which allows anyone to do a household survey. So putting that potential and that power in the hands of local peoples is important. We have to be much more accountable for results. And so we have now a scorecard, an annual scorecard of the results we want to see. It's public, and we will measure ourselves by it. We have to be more accountable to publics and to clients and to beneficiaries. So we now have a freedom of information policy based on the US and the Indian FOIAs. And we have an annual results report. We have to be much more interactive if we're going to find development solutions and measure results. And so, like UNICEF, we're looking at how can we build in beneficiary feedback to all our programs. It can be high-tech, SMS messaging, and I was just in Kenya where over 80% of the population have cell phones, and over 60% are paying all their bills through cell phones. We can use that technology. It can be relatively low-tech. The famous example in Uganda, where the local school budget was just put on the door of the school, and the parents were able to say, well, excuse me, this budget says we were meant to be budgeted for 2 teachers, but we only have 1. It can be a fantastic check on fraud and corruption. And we have to bring in more of the public, of the beneficiaries, into our results measurement. So we have to design indicators, but we have to also have publics saying the textbooks didn't arrive. The road is a road to nowhere. The child wasn't immunized. The health worker didn't turn up. That kind of beneficiary feedback in real time. And we're trying to match that with geo-mapping of all our projects. So I was just in Kenya, where looking at a community-driven development project, where the local project managers went around all the projects using handheld GPS devices on motorbikes and geo-mapped every single project. And then local beneficiaries can start to upload their information to those sites. The idea in my mind is to move to what I call B supervision, beneficiary supervision of all our projects, not just government supervision, not just bank supervision, but beneficiary supervision. And we need to bring in and build the capacity of local beneficiaries to do this. And so later today, we're launching a global partnership for social accountability, which means that we've long supported civil society, but we've tended to do it either through our actual projects or through trust funds. This will be the first time in the history of the bank that we are using net income, 20 million to start off as seed capital for this fund to build capacity to do social accountability in those countries that want it, where there is a need for it, and the type of things I'm talking about are citizen scorecards on the delivery of public services. I think what all this amounts to is a new way of looking at development, a new way of looking at development as a public space where the bank can be a convener or connector and can help facilitate some of the collection of data, the disclosure of data, the disclosure of results, but in a global partnership where development is no longer the province of the ivory tower or the ivory institution or academe or the expert. Development is about what happens on the ground with real people. And we need to move to evidence, not ideology. Evidence, not national flags on projects. Evidence that will allow feedback loops to improve everything we do with a quicker turnaround, as Tony said, than traditional data collection. So I think this is an extremely exciting time because what we're really talking about is democratizing development. We haven't solved all the problems. Every day we see new potential. We've done hackathons with groups. Random Hacks of Kindness has been a fantastic partner for us. We're doing crowdsourced citizen mapping to try and allow citizens to say where local health points are, where water access is, where schools are. In many of these countries, these maps simply don't exist. Governments themselves don't know where all these facilities are. So I think it's a great time to be doing development. It's a time when all our old traditional approaches are being challenged and should be challenged. And the bank looks forward to working with all of you. We have some very exciting partnerships with the foundation sector to help drive this new democratized development. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Caroline. I can't help but observe what's most striking to me about your comments. I think the World Bank has always been a learning institution, but you're describing the client differently. the client is the individual beneficiary rather than the state, the nation state that's your member and your boss. That's a fundamental change. Luis Ubiñas.
You know, let me start by saying that the crowd doesn't actually look that young to me. When Tony was saying there seems to be a new face in the audience, I was thinking I can picture who he means. Thank you. You know, I don't want the comments about the World Bank just made to go without note. I think we have seen in President Zelik's leadership, in the leadership of this management team, a revolution at the bank in terms of its transformation, in terms of its openness, in terms of its willingness to be held accountable for results. And I just want to thank Caroline and the entire team that is undoubtedly going to undergo some level of change with the new president coming, because we have seen a kind of leadership that is exceptionally rare on the global stage. So thank you. I'm going to be there later today, so I wanted to be nice, so that, maybe I can have a better lunch or something. I want to begin by taking a moment to thank Jane for organizing today's events. I know you're at the back end of the conference. These events are a tribute to how the Forum plays such a vital role in the philanthropic community, not only bringing so many of us together under one roof, but also in helping to enhance the strategic nature of our work. And lots of what I'm going to talk about is how we create results-driven strategic organizations in philanthropy. So I want to thank Jane and the rest of her team at the Forum as well. Thank you, Jane. Jane. Just know that was your audience who was hesitant to applaud. Today's session on the role of evidence in strategic grant making is one that I think is particularly timely for all of us and absolutely relevant to our work at the Ford Foundation. Quite simply, we believe that both persistence and a willingness to countenance failure are required to chart bold solutions to complex social problems. If you want to make progress, you have to take risks and you have to be willing to fail. But at the same time, this entrepreneurial approach must be balanced by a strategy that ensures you are achieving the results you seek. If risk is our mandate, and it is, we're risk capital, we're the venture capital of social change, then accountability for results has to be our guide. And it's important to understand the time we work in. In the midst of this fundamental, profound, and ongoing economic crisis, there is no hint it's over. Remember that. The need for accountability has never been more important. We have a moral imperative to be highly disciplined in managing our resources, to ensure they're being utilized, to maximize their potential, to maximize their results. In this environment, more than ever, outcomes matter, results matter. And they matter most to the people who we're meant to serve, the people who are engaged day to day in the struggle to make this world a better place. For the philanthropic community, it is perhaps the single most pressing challenge we face: accountability for results in the context of the ambiguity of the problems we deal with every day. Now, the question for us at Ford, the question for all of us here, is how we embed into our work a culture that maintains this laser-like focus on results. This really matters. How we as philanthropic leaders define, promote, and reinforce a commitment to a results culture, a culture that infuses all elements of our organizations, can profoundly influence whether our collective mission to make a difference in people's lives succeeds. At Ford, we've worked hard to embed a results-based culture in all our work, and to cultivate an environment that rewards and prizes accountability. For us, this means first and foremost an institution-wide commitment to clearly defined objectives, pursued with strategic clarity, substantial resources, and agreed upon methods. How on earth are you going to measure anything, evaluate anything, learn about anything, if you don't have clarity on what it is you're trying to accomplish, if you don't have an institutional strategy? It means dynamic resource allocation, accepting the principle that results drive resource allocation. Resources aren't a birthright. Program officers don't get equal resources. Issues don't get equal resources. Resources are earned. It means delineating roles and responsibilities to ensure accountability. How do we know who's succeeding and who's failing if we don't know who's supposed to do what? It means implementing this results-focused culture across the entire organization. The fact that you're not in program doesn't mean you get a free pass. Operations and endowment, everyone. If you work at one of our places, you have to hold the same level of accountability. There, as Tony said, I think very powerfully, there are people dying. They rely on us. They're children. They're mothers. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, it means active listening. And I want to talk about this in a complicated way. We've had several examples of how technology has transformed the capacity to listen, the capacity to gather data, the capacity to hear. Well, let's start with the thing we all do. At Ford, we're always trying to ask ourselves, what are we hearing from outside the organization? Most importantly, what are we hearing outside of philanthropy, outside of meetings like this, in the communities we're meant to work? Good old-fashioned listening, feet on the street, boots on the ground. You go in there and you pay attention. I spend an enormous amount of my time doing that. It matters. But outside voices can take other forms as well. Are the people we are hiring bringing in new skills, new perspectives, and new knowledge? Are we nurturing a robust network of people who we can rely on for advice and counsel? Seasoned, experienced, deeply knowledgeable people like Tony Lake, who can help us by serving as sounding boards? Are we finding ways to get broad-based input using digital tools in real time? I can't tell you the number of experiments we have around the world where people are giving us cell phone-based input, web-based input, huge amounts of content, real-time input and guidance on how an election is going and how a human rights violation challenge might be going. All the time, real time, with real partners. It's incredible, and it's easy to do now. Now, listening and learning to maximize results isn't easy. It's just as hard as building that kind of results-based culture. When we rebuilt the foundation strategy in 2008, we engaged more than 4,000 grantees and other experts, and we believe every one of them played a role in reshaping and revitalizing our work. Many of you here, in fact, were part of that effort. When we hired nearly 100 new program staff members over the last 3 years, we looked for people who would bring new ways of working, new models for leadership, again, to bring lessons to us. Now, I have to say, a culture focused on results, a culture which begs for input, guidance, outside knowledge, isn't always comfortable. It has many of the stresses of the marketplace. It demands effectiveness and efficiency. Moreover, the cultural transformation often required to build a results-focused culture, a learning culture, especially at a large institution like the ones many of you work in, is undeniably hard work. The transition to a results-driven culture, an accountability-centered culture, requires tenacity, but the rewards are significant and hold the promise of making our work and its outcomes more successful and enduring. And I can't take the lessons we heard a second ago from UNICEF more seriously. There are people whose lives depend on our ability to use every scrap of resource we now have to make a difference in their lives. And so that's the challenge. That's a challenge for us. That's the conversation we're about to have. Thank you.
Thank you, Luis. I'm actually going to open with you, Luis. When we, in fact, Luis has just authored an article on evaluation and accountability in SSIR, Stanford Social Innovation Review, with other members of the Aspen Philanthropy Group. When you think about the fundamental purpose of evaluation, to inform the foundation's decision-making, to inform the grantee's decision-making, what about the question of field-wide knowledge? What about spreading that knowledge well beyond that grantee-grantor relationship?
You know, I don't see the requirement to, let's call it, proselytize for the best of our work as just linked to evaluation. I think it is the day-to-day responsibility of my team, of philanthropy in general, to take what they're learning real time, not in periodic evaluations, real time, and fight for it. And fight for it. Because our job is to drive change. Our job is to make a difference in people's lives. And that doesn't happen. It isn't denominated in a half decade or every 3 years. It's denominated in minutes, as we just heard. And when we learn something, and we learn something all the time, when we learn about how to bring conditional cash transfers to a new country in a way that is driven by relationship between two senior leaders, and we learn that, lo and behold, a little bit of travel money can make a difference that we could never have made with facts and figures. We need to let people know that, because maybe that instance where the head of South Africa's social service provision organization and the head of the Peruvian social service support organization, who hadn't met, taught each other a lot. Very little investment, but maybe we should be doing more of that. Learning, even in trivial examples, needs to be shared constantly, not just in moments of evaluation.
So it's a continuous feedback loop plus a continuous sharing.
Right. It's continuous sharing above all else. It's literally taking everything you know in an open source world, taking everything you know and arguing for it and putting it out there. Not in the media where it makes you feel good because you got it in the New York Times.
And not just your website.
Irrelevant. It is literally in the day-to-day relationship-based work of working with the World Bank, of working with USAID, of working with embassies in different places, working with DFID, working with other philanthropies.
Caroline, I was most struck by your conversation about sharing data. If you're sharing the data that you've gathered, if UNDP is also a part of that, if various bilateral aid agencies are a part of that, and if major foundations, in fact, not just major, foundations are a part of that, you could have extraordinary, you could up the impact of all. I have a sort of a nerdy question, and that is the software in place? Do your data sets speak the same language? Do you even have the same concept of geography? I mean, how are those barriers overcome?
I think we've tried working with all those across the UN system and OECD and others to make sure we're pooling all our data, and we're doing it in a similar way. So we have a product called the World Development Indicators, which brings together everybody's indicators. I think in some areas, we're still very challenged. Aid flows is a really critical part of data sharing, to know who exactly is giving money. And there we've just all signed up to an International Aid Transparency Initiative, so we will try and do that. But sometimes the not-for-profit sector is outside of that, and we still have a lot of work to do. A lot of governments find it hard to themselves know what aid is coming into their country. I used to work on Haiti, and I remember the Haitian government felt that they really had no idea of what was coming in. And as you know, fantastic work done by civil society and foundations in Haiti, but some you have pockets of real success, amid an ocean of devastation. So unless the government knows, it doesn't know where to put its resources to offset where there are gaps in perhaps private funding coming in. So we have to do more work on that, sharing the data and identifying the data gaps. And this is where I think we can all work with others and work with government statistical offices to try and fill in gaps. It is a fact that we're all making judgments on Africa every day, Africa's development strategy, without always having, as Tony said, up-to-date indicators. I think on the question of results, we really have to have these very strong feedback loops. And here I think we have to be able to try different randomized approaches. I'm thinking a case in Zambia, I think, for some of the HIV/AIDS work. They looked at different ways of delivering the drugs, and they found there was a problem with some of the drugs being stuck in storage and not getting out to the local community health workers. So that they tried different approaches in different parts of the country. They found a way, because of different experiments, if you like, not experiments, but different ways of doing it, they found a way that worked very well, of stocking the warehouses and then shipping out the drugs. And then they scaled that up countrywide. If you look at the way that the Chinese have done development, it's very interesting. And China has reduced more people, brought more people out of poverty than any other country as a percentage, not just as a total amount. And in fact, it's been China's poverty-reducing efforts that have really enabled the world to reach the first Millennium Development Goal. They pilot approaches before they spread it nationwide. Of course, they have a huge nation to spread it across. But that idea of trying to use different approaches, see what works, scale it up, and then integrate impact evaluation in how you design new projects, it's, I think, very important and a growing area. I wanted to say one issue about admitting to failure. I think this is the hardest thing for anyone. And it's harder if you're a small institution. We're not, and it's even harder for the bank. It's hard for the bank, and we're not small. But if you're a small foundation, a small institution that really depends on 1 or 2 or 3 funders, it's very difficult to say, actually, we failed in these 5 areas, because your funding stream may be cut off. And I think that is the biggest challenge we all have, to explain that development is about risk. If it wasn't, poverty would have been solved years ago. I mean, we've made good progress. But risk, and I love the way you talked about venture capital for what works and for success. Like all venture capitalists, or venture developmentists, put it like that, you're going to have failure. And so we have to be able to work with that. But it is damn hard.
Now, of course, a venture capitalist is not accountable to any political process, where it's quite hard. If USAID says, here are our 5 whopping failures, that could be a cut in the budget. So that is often a consideration that we all have to bear in mind, is that the accountability is different according to what kind of institution you're in. Louise, what do we know? You're talking about a culture shift within an institution, within the Ford Foundation. The Ford Foundation also tries to achieve sort of normative shifts in the outside world. I mean, it's worked on human rights for years. It is worked in very tough areas where you have to start by changing minds, or one of your goals is to change minds. What do we know about how a culture changes? What does it take, no matter what the setting?
This is something that we've been asking ourselves a lot about in the context of a new initiative we're launching called Girls Not Brides, which is trying to stem the rampant early marriage of young girls as young as 8, 10, 11. You know, there are 10 million of them a year, girls married prematurely like this. And if you imagine 200 million in a generation, 2.5 generations alive, that's 500 million girls sent into these premature marriages that cut off their educational and economic opportunities. How many of these children living on $1.25 a day are the children of those girls? And what is really the root cause of that poverty? We understand that to tackle that problem, we have first and foremost a cultural question that has to be answered. How do we make it culturally unacceptable? It turns out that in the 1970s, the rate of early marriage in Brazil and in Mexico was almost as high as it is in some of the worst places extant today in Africa and in some parts of India. And we looked at how they succeeded in bringing those early marriage rates down to negligible numbers. And by the way, in the process, changed the economic trajectory of their countries, changed the population growth trajectories of their country, changed the poverty dynamics in their countries in the process. And it took, in those countries, the confluence, the combination, the partnership of media, traditional commercial media, Globo in Brazil, for example, the church, the Catholic Church in Mexico, absolutely central. And then government programs like conditional cash transfer programs that linked the retention of a girl in a home and in a school to aid programs, to individual aid programs. It took that kind of public voice to say, it's just not okay. It's not okay from the pulpit. It's not okay on the telenovela. It's not okay in terms of government policy. And that kind of multidimensional public, private, even religious sector effort is what's required to achieve cultural change. Human rights is no different. I spent a lot of time talking to, among other people, one of the original founders of Human Rights Watch. And he said we had to establish a dialogue that said it wasn't okay. We had to establish a dialogue that said, I know that's happening in Eritrea. I know that's happening in northern Nigeria. We all remember that. But it's not okay. And we, even though we're not of that country, have the right to intervene in defense of the individual, in defense of the fellow human, not necessarily the fellow citizen. We take that for granted now. That's a given in our culture now. Everywhere, that's nearly everywhere, that's a given. That's because they understood that from all elements of society, that message needed to be delivered, and it became part of the cultural norm.
As we pull up the light so that we can take questions from the audience, Caroline, I just wanted to note, we of course, Bob Zellick addressed this group a couple of nights ago, and what was striking, one of the striking things he said, and that you've reiterated, is that the banks support civil society institutions themselves. You've got this accountability project where you're in essence going around your bosses, governments, directly to their populations to ask them to keep account of their government's actions. Is this welcomed by the governments?
I think the answer is both yes and no. First of all, we've done a lot with civil society through our traditional operations. For example, when I was the country director for Haiti, the Haitian government was having its first ever public transparent budget. And we, as part of that grant, we helped build the capacity of a civil society group to monitor that transparency. And the government was fine with that. And the money came out of the grant. And as I say, we've had trust funds. So we've been actually doing about $53 million a year to civil society through our regular operations. What is different about this is, A, that we're using net income. And the net income is the money we make from the interest rate that's charged on lending to middle-income countries. So we're using 20 million of that. We are going to do this social accountability in countries where the government wants to be a partner. And I think this is important because there are a lot of organizations beginning to do social accountability now. What is different about the bank and what beneficiaries are saying to us and civil society is saying to us is the bank has that triangular relationship with government, with the development, and with the civil society. So civil society wants to have often a partnership with government to do it. So this isn't a question of doing it despite of government. This is a question of working to build capacity so that citizens in countries can monitor service delivery with scorecards. It's one of the big things that we will fund. It's being done in India, in many regions, to make sure, was the water delivered, was the garbage delivered, does the sanitation work? And many governments recognize that that kind of citizen feedback and make it accountable is very important. The famous case is the Philippines, where they have a website called Check My School, which is a partnership between the Ministry of Education and civil society, so that parents will report on the quality of the education, the textbooks, and they use that. So I wouldn't see this as either or. I see this as a recognition that citizen voice, and especially beneficiary voice, is important for development outcomes. And that was why I started saying some people can see that as a political issue. We think it's actually a development effectiveness issue. And so it should be part of the bank's remit.
I'm going to turn to you for questions and just point out, if we don't get a chance to get to it, is that there are a number of partnerships with foundations in the World Bank, including the effort to eradicate polio, but there are a number. We'll start with Randall, and then we'll go back here. Wait for the mic, Randall.
Thanks. I'm Randall Kempner with the Aspen Network of Development Entrepreneurs. I heard across all of the speakers a challenge to foundations and organizations to take risk, yet also a great deal of focus on accountability. It seems like there could be a lot of conflict there. Do you really promote people that took a lot of risk but don't have a lot of results? And more broadly, how do you create systems within your organizations to really promote both of those things in an effective way?
Luis.
I don't hold in the least that an accountability-based culture doesn't take risk. If you think about Sand Hill Road, to continue with this analogy, these folks fail completely 6 out of 10 times. They basically break even 3 out of 10 times, and only 1 out of 10 times do they make substantial returns. Those people live with risk sometimes for years and years and years, and then come to their success, and those people are very rewarded. I think the idea that we have to be meek because it's easier to hold people accountable, that we have to do little things like deliver cans at community food banks, as opposed to tackle the huge issue of economic inequity that leads people to being in those food banks. It's easier to count the delivery of the cans. By the way, exceptionally important. I happen to support one of those, and I know what it is. It's a salve, because I personally don't feel I can do something about the bigger issue at home. But when I come to my work, when you all go to your jobs, your job is to do your job, your challenge is to do the harder thing, to attack the problem at its root cause, at its riskier level, to ask yourself, why is it that in a country this rich, people have to go get cans? Why is it that our minimum wage leaves someone in poverty, even if they're working 40 hours a week, 7 days, 52 weeks a year, never taking a week off? How is that? How is that ethical? How is that right? Much riskier as a problem, but a problem worthy of our effort. And yes, we have to accept the fact that sometimes we're going to have to promote someone who fought valiantly, who did everything right, and the thing didn't work.
Luis, I know that one of the tools you've used is to actually have the size of the grant budget be flexible and be tied to results. What is the time frame of that? Because there are annual grants budgets, but you're really measuring long-term performance with an assumption of lots of failure along the way.
It's this balance between having long-term stability and funding for long-term problems, and then flexible funding available hourly. We found out the other day that this great experiment we have ongoing at 8 states in the United States, we're working with governors to reformulate how they deliver benefits to poor people so that huge sums don't go into the bureaucracy, so that people don't have to reapply for something like food stamps, which is free to the governor. The federal government pays all of it effectively at some level. so that they don't have to keep coming back every 3 months, and if they don't come back, falling off the rolls. We found out that one of our target states just wanted to continue the work with us, that Republican governor saw the value of it, and like the other governors, wanted to continue. And we needed an extra several $1 million to do that, a commitment of several $1 million over the next few years as that project goes into phase 2, deep implementation with many families benefiting. You have to be able to have flexible resources to deploy into your most successful things, even as you've planned exquisitely over 3 to 5 years.
I should note that,
Jane,
yes, Caroline.
I just want to say a word on that question, because I think this is the heart of the dilemma. How do you get people to take risk? But they have to be informed risk, and you have to be able to, when something goes wrong, you have to be able to differentiate, because it went wrong because due to circumstances beyond your control, not due to mismanagement in any way, because you can't give carte blanche to people. I think it demands a huge change in culture. At the bank, as Jan knows, we have a board representing 187 countries. The tradition used to be, you take your loan to the board, it gets approved, the bigger the better, you get your promotion. And then you move to something else, so you don't even supervise your own project. We have to change, break that cycle, but now I think we can do it. And the interesting thing of why is because now we have better ways of looking at results. So when you go into a program, we can have a much better accounting of what are going to be the results and what are going to be the risks. So for a project where you might expect very big results, you would be prepared to take more risk. For a project that might give you very few results, I mean, do you want to take those risks? And then the other key thing is not to put all the accountability and responsibility on the person and the poor project leader. Vice presidents, managing directors, presidents of institutions have to back that person and say, I am accountable for this project. It may be risky, but I support it. Go ahead. And that means also a different nature of, who's prepared to stand up and sign on something. Don't drive it down to the poor task team leader.
Last question.
Thank you. My name is Patrick Alley from an NGO, Global Witness in London. First off, I declare a vested interest. We're a Ford grantee. The question I have is a question for the panel, and also a challenge, I think, to many people in the audience. In Europe, at least, and I don't know if it's the same in America, there's a real challenge in evaluating advocacy. Whereas, providing immunization for children may not be easy to measure, it is at least measurable. With advocacy, it can take a very long time to get to where you want to be. And we have a real example in that one of our aims, for example, is to end the militarization of mining sites in Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo. And an evaluation firm last year said, well, they failed. Well, yeah, we did. We didn't say we were going to do it in a year. And an important example, I think, and it relates to Tony Lake's issues of husbanding limited resources to deal with the massive issues he has to deal with. How do you deal with a country like Angola, for example, where child mortality under 5 is around 25%, and around 25% of the country's oil revenues are stolen every year? The country has the money, it's stolen. I'll be very quick. We worked with other NGOs for a decade to finally get an amendment to the Dodd-Frank Act, which requires extractive companies to publish what they pay. Critical, it took 10 years. If the funders had cut off funding to any organization in that process, it may not have happened. So my question is...
We need time for the answer.
Yeah, my question is, does Ford or do other philanthropists here have a method of effectively measuring advocacy, and if not, can they develop one?
I think this is a fantastic question, and a very, very important one. These people shy away from advocacy. In fact, people shy away from the complex because it's harder to measure. It's also important for us, in particular, because much of what we do sits in this category of the intractable. Like the example I started with, the Girls Not Brides campaign. Goodness gracious, intractable. How we think about this is based on the life cycle of the effort. And people think, especially given the fashion of the day, that the way you measure is in this highly quantitative, medicalized way where you create controls and then you match them. Now, the problem with that is you only then do things that fall into that kind of measurement window. And this is a lesson, just as a personal aside, that my wife taught me many years ago. She wrote this book called Qualitative and Quantitative Methods in Social Science Research. And her message way back then was that you can hold social science research to the same kind of standards, but you need to be a little more sophisticated. You need to be a little more qualitative. You need to be a little more patient. What we've done is we've established this methodology that's driven by the life cycle of a project. And early in its life cycle, we ask simple questions. Are you doing the things you said you're going to do? Is the network there? Are the relationships there? Are the partners coming together? Are they doing what they said? Are they in the telenovelas in the right way? Can we see that? Are they on the pulpits in the right way? Can we hear that? Are the government, well, then as we move to a program that's fully developed and fully implemented where the basic elements of success are in place, if they're not, there's no reason to proceed. There's information in that. That should be controllable, even if it's advocacy. Are we then beginning to see what I call interim results? And this should be familiar to many of the people here. Interim results like, are the government policies beginning to shift? Are the conditional cash transfer programs moving toward not just keeping children in school, but specifically keeping girls in school? Are they tracking whether the girls are married or not? Their day-to-day participation, their pregnancy rates. Are those kinds of things that matter to us in the Girls Not Brides program and should matter to anybody dealing with children's poverty, being infused in the conditional cash transfer programs and the other more tangible elements? Advocacy, you can hold advocacy accountable for that. It still doesn't get to end results. These end results take time. And then for late stage efforts, and our conditional cash transfer efforts are a good example of this, are we getting people in the programs in higher numbers? That used to be a little bit of what we did when we started the work low those many years ago in little tiny numbers. But in the countries we're targeting, are we getting those policies in place? Matching a deep understanding of where that initiative is, where that advocacy effort sits, with appropriate benchmarks for success and results based on where it sits, begins to answer the question of whether or not you can measure advocacy. And it's really important that we can hold advocacy accountable, because it is that inability to measure it, to hold it accountable, to think about it qualitatively, then later quantitatively, that makes people afraid to participate in it, makes it hard for us to find enough partners, that makes it hard for you as a grantee to find enough funders.
I'm sorry to say we've run out of time. I just want to close with one note, and that is we spent a lot of time on Egypt last night. There were only 2 external foundations that were active in Egypt over the years, the Aga Khan Foundation and the Ford Foundation. And of course the World Bank, including the World Bank's International Finance Corporation, has played an active role throughout that time. Think if results had been measured in only annual terms, and think if the data only came from governments in terms of feedback. Thank you so much to Tony Lake, to Caroline Anstey, and to Luis Ubiñas.